So imagine a kid, right? He's got this genius level IQ of like 149.
Oh, wow. That is incredibly high.
Yeah, exactly. And he's raised by this hyper-strict Navy Admiral father. Plus, he spends all his free time in high school reading these super dense 16th century books on demonology.
Which is definitely not your average teenager behavior.
Not at all. So you would probably expect a kid like that to grow up to be, I don't know, a rogue academic or maybe a high-level defense contractor.
Right, something highly intellectual and disciplined.
Exactly. But instead, he became the ultimate symbol of 1960s countercultural defiance. I'm talking about Jim Morrison.
It is honestly one of the most fascinating paradoxes in modern pop culture because we have this collective, almost cartoonish archetype of the 1960s rock god.
Oh, for sure. The leather pants, the wild hair.
Right, gripping the microphone stand like it's a weapon. And we just assume these figures were naturally chaotic, born completely unhinged.
Yeah.
But Morrison's reality was entirely different. It was calculated.
And that is exactly our mission for today's deep dive. Welcome, by the way. We have an extensive, highly detailed dossier today on the life, the art, and the ultimate death of Jim Morrison.
And there is a lot to get through.
There really is. We're going to bypass those easy rock star cliches to decode how this persona was meticulously constructed and, ultimately, how it completely consumed the man who built it. Okay, let's unpack this, because the facts in these sources are bizarre, and they just completely rewrite the narrative of the Lizard King.
Yeah, to really understand the chaotic frontman, we first have to examine the exact opposite environment.
His childhood.
Right. The intensely disciplined, sort of semi-nomadic military home he was raised in. He was born in 1943, and his father, George Stephen Morrison, was a strict career Navy man. He would actually eventually become a rear admiral.
And his father wasn't just, like, pushing papers at a desk either.
No, not at all.
The sources note he actually commanded U.S. naval forces during the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, which, as we know, was a massive geopolitical flashpoint.
It really was. And the historical irony there is just profound.
How so?
Well, think about it. While the father is commanding naval forces in an incident that fundamentally escalates the Vietnam War, the son is simultaneously transforming into an icon for the exact generation that will take to the streets to protest that same war.
Wow. Yeah, that is a huge disconnect.
But to understand Morrison's psychology, you have to look at how discipline was actually handled inside that house. They didn't really use physical punishment.
Right, I read this part. They used this military tradition known as a dressing down.
Exactly.
His brother Andy talked about this in the source material. Instead of spanking the kids, the parents would just berate and yell at them. They would systematically break them down psychologically.
Just tearing them apart with words.
Yeah, until they were literally reduced to tears and had to verbally acknowledge their failings. It's an intense mental submission.
And what's fascinating here is how Morrison reacted to that psychological pressure cooker.
Right.
He didn't conform to the military expectation, but he didn't initially rebel in a traditional physical way either. Instead, he retreated entirely into his intellect.
Ah, so that's where the high IQ comes in.
Exactly. As you mentioned, testing in the top 0.1% for IQ, he became this voracious, almost obsessive reader. His high school English teacher actually had to go to the Library of Congress to verify that the obscure books Morrison was writing reports on even existed.
That is wild because, he was reporting on 16th and 17th century texts on demonology. The teacher naturally assumed a teenager was just making those titles up.
Right, it sounds like a prank. But he wasn't making them up, he was mining them.
Mining them for what?
For an identity. He was reading philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche and French poets like Arthur Rimbaud. He was actively searching for tools to construct his own mythological origin story.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, he wanted to blend this intense, dark literary imagination with his real-world experiences, basically to create a completely new identity, entirely independent of his father's shadow.
Which brings us to the famous 1947 New Mexico car crash story.
Oh, yes. The origin myth.
Right, this is the cornerstone of the Morrison myth. So he claimed that when he was about 4 years old, his family drove past a horrific accident in the desert. And he famously described seeing Indians scattered all over the highway, bleeding to death. And then he claimed that the spirits of those dying Native Americans actually leaped into his soul.
And he pointed to that moment constantly throughout his life. He wove it into the song Peace Frog. He recited it in spoken word pieces.
It was his whole brand.
Exactly. He explicitly stated that he was like a psychic sponge that day, absorbing those souls, which is what gave him his sort of shamanic energy on stage.
But, and this is a huge, but the sources show his family completely contradicts the details of this story.
Yeah, the reality is very different.
His father acknowledged they drove past a crash, and the young Jim was upset by a crying Native American man on the side of the road. But he insists there was absolutely no bloody massacre.
Right.
His sister flat out said Jim's version was entirely exaggerated. And historical research confirms that while there was a fatal crash that day, the single passenger who died wasn't even indigenous.
It's all fabricated.
So I have to ask you, is this just, the 1960s equivalent of a celebrity fabricating a PR backstory?
Yeah.
Or do you think he genuinely convinced himself that these ghosts inhabited him to cope with the trauma of his strict childhood?
It is likely a really deeply psychological mix of both.
Really, both.
Yeah, drawing from his reading of French existentialists who basically believed that human beings have to actively create their own meaning in an absurd world, Morrison understood something fundamental.
Which was?
That to be a true visionary, you had to alter your own reality. By rewriting that childhood memory, he took control of his narrative.
So he's taking the power back.
Exactly. He was no longer just the helpless son of a hypercritical Navy officer being dressed down in a living room. He was a shaman.
Okay, so he's armed with this self-created mythological identity, which naturally pushes him away from his military family.
Right. He has to leave that world behind.
He goes to Florida State University briefly, where, by the way, he gets arrested at a football game for disturbing the peace while drunk. Which we'll see is a major, major recurring theme.
Definitely a preview of coming attraction.
Yeah. But then he transfers to UCLA's film program.
And UCLA is where the intellectual blueprint for The Doors is really finalized. He enrolls in a comparative literature class focused on the French playwright Antonin Artaud.
Okay.
Now, Artaud is crucial here. He was the architect of what he called the theater of cruelty.
And we should clarify for everyone listening, cruelty in this context doesn't mean literal physical torture, right?
Exactly. No, it's not about violence.
Right.
Artaud believed that traditional theater was just too polite, too safe.
It was boring.
Right. So the theater of cruelty was about stripping away the polite veneer of society. It was designed to be a dark, primal assault on the senses.
Making the audience uncomfortable.
Yes, making them feel viscerally unsafe so they would wake up from their sort of suburban hypnosis. Artaud wanted art to bypass the intellect entirely and just shock the subconscious.
And Morrison completely internalizes this. He realizes he doesn't want to just entertain people. He wants to psychologically disrupt them.
Absolutely.
So he graduates in 1965, but refuses to even attend the ceremony. The university actually just mails his diploma to his mother.
Because he's already moved on.
Right. He moves onto the rooftop of a building in Venice Beach, California. And according to his classmate Ray Manzarek, he's living on a diet of canned beans and LSD.
Which, again, traces directly back to his reading. The poet Rimbaud famously wrote that an artist must become a visionary through and this is a quote, long, immense, and rational derangement of all the senses.
Wow. Derangement of the senses.
Yeah. For Morrison, the LSD and the extreme diets weren't about partying. They were a literary method, a way to achieve that derangement.
It's just wild. So it's on that beach where he runs into Manzarek, shares some of his poetry, and they decide to form The Doors.
A very literary band from the start.
Even the name. It comes from Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception, which Huxley himself took from a William Blake quote about cleansing the doors of perception to see everything as infinite.
It's all deeply intellectual.
But here's the thing that really surprised me in the sources. Morrison wasn't actually a musician.
Not in the traditional sense, no. He didn't play an instrument live aside from, like, shaking maracas or a tambourine.
Right.
He would occasionally tinker with the piano in the studio, but his primary method was composing vocal melodies completely in his head to match his poetry.
So he's just humming these tunes.
Basically. And the rest of the band, Manzarek on keys, Robbie Krieger on guitar, and John Densmore on drums, had the incredibly difficult job of building these complex jazz and blues chords around Morrison's a cappella vocals.
I picture it like a film director working with a cast of brilliant actors.
Yeah.
He wasn't holding the camera or building the set. He was just handing them this dark, emotional script and basically saying, hey, Make this sound like a psychedelic nightmare.
That's a really strong analogy, though. Imagine a film director who refuses to even write down the script and instead just vaguely hums the mood he wants.
Right, forcing the actors to just read his mind.
Exactly. It requires a massive amount of musical interpretation from the band. But Morrison was absolutely an auteur. He was using a rock band as his medium for Artaud's theater.
Even his look was planned out, wasn't it?
Oh, completely. His iconic physical presence was highly curated. Those famous leather pants, inspired by Marlon Brando in The Fugitive Kind, and by contemporary dancers.
The way he acted on stage.
His brooding stage presence was something he learned by watching Van Morrison perform. The doors opened for Van's band, Them, at the Whiskey A Go-Go.
Ah, so he studied Van Morrison's air of menace, like how he would crouch by the drum kit and improvise poetry over a rock beat.
Yes, he took notes on all of it.
So Jim Morrison is essentially synthesizing Artaud's psychological theater, Brando's visual aesthetic, and Van Morrison's stage menace into this singular, magnetic frontman.
That's exactly what he did. But this is where the narrative really shifts.
Right, because things get dark.
Because this Artaud-inspired theatrical shock tactic worked brilliantly in a small, dark club in Los Angeles. But when the Doors achieved sudden, massive national fame, that carefully constructed rebellion triggered a collision.
A collision with the mainstream.
Yes, with mainstream authority. And, more tragically, a collision with Morrison's own darkest impulses.
So what happens when this dark, underground theatrical act suddenly gets booked on mainstream, family-friendly television?
Well, we find out in September 1967.
Right, when they're booked on The Ed Sullivan Show. The network censors look at the lyrics for their massive hit, Light My Fire, and insist they change the line, "Girl, we couldn't get much higher to better," because obviously higher is a drug reference.
And the band, wanting the national exposure, reluctantly agrees to the change while they're in the dressing room.
Right, they agree. But then they go out on live television, broadcast to millions of American living rooms, and Morrison just leans into the microphone and sings the original uncensored lyric anyway.
He couldn't help himself.
Ed Sullivan was furious. He refused to shake their hands. A producer actually came up to them and explicitly told them they would never do the show again.
And Morrison's response was just incredible.
Yes, so nonchalant. He just goes, "Hey, man, so what? We just did the Sullivan Show."
That moment cemented his status as a countercultural hero because he refused to compromise the script of his performance for polite society.
But that boundary pushing didn't stop at television censors, did it?
Not at all. Later that year in New Haven, Connecticut, he became the first rock star to ever be arrested on stage during a live performance.
And the escalation of that event is almost absurd.
It really is.
Before the show, a local police officer finds Morrison and a woman making out in the backstage showers. The cop doesn't recognize the lead singer of the band he's guarding, so he orders him to leave. Morrison mockingly tells the cop to eat me, and the cop responds by spraying him in the face with mace.
Which Morrison then turns into performance art.
And try.
Once he recovers and actually gets on stage, he refuses to just sing the hits. He stops the music and tells the audience this obscenity-filled version of the shower incident. He is openly mocking the police who are standing right there in the venue.
Cooking the bear.
Yeah, he pushes them until they actually step onto the stage and arrest him for indecency mid-performance.
But underneath this anti-authoritarian theater, a much darker biological reality was taking hold, right? Severe alcohol dependence.
Yes, very severe.
The Doors producer, Paul Rothchild, noted that Morrison was essentially living a Jekyll and Hyde existence. When he was sober, he was Jekyll, the erudite, balanced, friendly poet.
Right.
But when he drank heavily, he turned into an unpredictable, destructive maniac that his inner circle referred to as Jimbo.
And this is where we really have to look at the psychological mechanics of his fame. Morrison was trapped in a brutal feedback loop.
How so?
Well, the audience was buying tickets to see the chaotic, dangerous Lizard King they read about in the press. But to deliver that extreme, Artaud-level theatrical experience every single night, Morrison had to lower his own inhibitions.
Oh, and he used alcohol to do it.
Exactly. He used alcohol to achieve that state. The more the audience demanded the monster, the more he drank, which drove him deeper and deeper into the destructive Jimbo persona.
That's crap.
By 1969, the curated aesthetic was completely gone. He had gained weight, grown a heavy beard, and was frequently showing up to recording sessions entirely incapacitated.
Which all culminates in the infamous Miami incident on March 1st, 1969. He's performing at the Dinner Key Auditorium. He is visibly intoxicated, interrupting the song, screaming obscenities at the crowd.
Berating them, really.
Yeah, essentially berating them for just wanting to hear the hits. He attempts to spark a literal riot, and at one point asks the crowd if they want to see his genitals.
Which leads to warrants for his arrest for indecent exposure and profanity.
Right, and he was ultimately convicted by a 6-person jury and sentenced to 6 months in prison, a verdict he was actually in the process of appealing while free on a $50,000 bond when he died.
It's worth noting the band members always maintain that while he definitely taunted the crowd, he never actually exposed himself, and he was completely pardoned posthumously by the state of Florida in 2010.
But looking at the mechanics of this, I have a question for you. Here's where it gets really interesting. Was the Miami incident an intentional avant-garde theater performance meant to wake up a complacent audience? Or was it just the sad reality of a guy who was completely out of control and making excuses for it?
That is the exact line between art and pathology that Morrison was blurring. Interestingly, in an interview after the arrest, Morrison seemed remarkably clear-eyed about the sociological implications of his trial.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He noted that navigating the judicial system opened his eyes to his own privilege. He watched black men receiving 20-year prison sentences in 5 minutes and realized that if he hadn't possessed unlimited funds and highly paid lawyers, he would have been locked up immediately.
Wow. That is a surprisingly grounded realization for someone who seemed so detached from reality at the time.
It shows that intellect was still there.
But while he could clearly analyze the systemic structures of society, his personal structures were entirely collapsing. The complete breakdown of his public boundaries was perfectly mirrored in his private life, where he went to extreme lengths to compartmentalize his relationships and his past.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to go back to his reading of Nietzsche.
Okay, the philosopher.
Right. Nietzsche wrote about the Übermensch, or living beyond good and evil, the idea that exceptional individuals shouldn't be constrained by the traditional moral structures of society.
And Morrison thought he was one of those exceptional individuals.
Morrison was attempting to literally live that philosophy. But applying that total freedom to a 20-something rock star's personal life, it leaves a massive trail of emotional wreckage for everyone around him.
His family is the starkest example of that. As his fame exploded, he literally told the national press that his parents and siblings were dead or that he was an only child.
Which is just so cold. His sister theorized that he did this to protect their father's advancing Navy career, to keep those two volatile worlds entirely separate.
But the reality feels closer to total erasure to me. Admiral Morrison wasn't exactly a supportive background figure.
No, not at all.
In 1970, he actually wrote a letter to the parole board regarding Jim's Miami conviction, revealing that he had previously advised his son to give up singing entirely due to a, quote, complete lack of talent.
Ouch. When the hyper-disciplined father you spent your whole life trying to escape writes that down on official government letterhead, the psychological rejection is absolute.
Think about how wild this is for a moment for everyone listening. You are a global icon. You are on the cover of magazines everywhere. But you are so detached from your roots that your own brother finds out you are a famous rock star by randomly buying the Doors' debut record and recognizing your voice on it.
It's unbelievable.
That's not just protecting your family. Was he protecting them or just erasing them?
Erasing his past was really the only way he could fully embody the myth he created. But this rejection of traditional bonds made his romantic relationships incredibly chaotic, too.
Oh, yeah. The source is full of this.
His primary partner was Pamela Corson. He referred to her as his cosmic mate. He dedicated his published poetry books to her, and his will named her as his sole heir.
But the relationship was highly volatile. Both of them were engaging in other relationships. Morrison was constantly involved with fans, musicians, journalists.
It was a very open, messy situation.
At one point, he participated in a Celtic neo-pagan hand-fasting ceremony with the rock critic Patricia Keneally. They signed a document and were declared wed by a high priestess in 1970.
Yet, when Keneally later informed him she was pregnant, she stated that his demeanor turned completely cold. The Nietzschean freedom he demanded meant that he hadn't taken the emotional weight of that ceremony as seriously as she had.
He just wanted the experience without the responsibility, and his behavior alienated his peers too. Janis Joplin famously hit him over the head with a bottle of Southern Comfort after he treated her cruelly and wouldn't leave her alone at a party.
Yeah, she referred to him with expletives from then on.
He was a man who demanded absolute freedom from consequence. But the sources note that at the time of his death, there were 37 pending paternity actions against him.
37. It completely shatters the romanticized ideal of the free-spirited poet. Absolute freedom for Morrison meant absolute chaos for everyone else.
It really did.
Ugh.
So exhausted by the wreckage of his public persona, the emotional toll of his private life, and the looming threat of actual prison time for the Miami conviction, Morrison decides to flee.
He needs an escape.
After recording the brilliant L.A. Woman album, he takes a formal leave of absence from the Doors in March 1971 and moves to Paris with Pamela Corson.
To the one place he thought he could finally just be a writer. He genuinely seemed to be attempting to shed the toxic rock star avatar.
How so?
Well, he shaved his heavy beard, lost a significant amount of weight, and just spent his days taking long, anonymous walks through the city. He kept a notebook that was later recovered, appropriately titled The Paris Journal.
But that journal is incredibly haunting. It contains an allegorical poem about a man grieving, having his belongings hauled away by police due to a death connected to the Chinese opium trade.
Wow.
He writes, "I hope the Chinese junkies get you, for the opium poppy rules the world." It's incredibly dark, specific foreshadowing.
Because the fresh start didn't save him. On the morning of July 3rd, 1971, Pamela Corson found Jim Morrison dead in the bathtub of their Paris apartment. He was just 27 years old.
27.
The official cause of death was listed by the medical examiner as heart failure.
And Corson gave inconsistent accounts of his final moments over the years. She claimed his last words to her were either, "Pam, I think I'm drowning," or simply, "Pam, are you still there?"
Tragic either way.
But here is the critical detail in the source material. Because French law at the time did not require an autopsy when foul play wasn't immediately suspected by the authorities, no autopsy was ever performed.
And that lack of biological certainty is the exact mechanism that cemented his legend forever.
Right. It leaves it open.
It created a vacuum of truth that was immediately filled by endless conspiracy theories. A Paris nightclub manager named Sam Burnett later claimed Morrison actually died of a heroin overdose in the bathroom of his club, and his body was secretly moved back to the apartment.
There's so many theories.
Others claimed he faked his own death to finally escape fame. The filmmaker, Agnes Varda, who was a friend, admitted she helped hide the news of his death from the public for days to prevent a media circus.
You know, I look at his death like a locked room mystery novel where the final page has just been ripped out.
That's a great way to put it.
Because there was no autopsy, we are permanently denied the closure of biological facts. It leaves us with nothing but the myth. The biological reality of what actually happened in that apartment rotted away decades ago.
Leaving just the legend.
Right. And he becomes permanently frozen as a mythic figure in the tragic 27 Club, dying exactly 2 years to the day after Rolling Stones guitarist Brian Jones and just months after Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin.
He was buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, a historic site shared by massive cultural figures like Oscar Wilde and Edith Piaf. For years, the grave had no official marker.
Just dirt.
Busts and statues placed by fans were repeatedly stolen, and the surrounding tombs were heavily vandalized with graffiti.
But eventually, his father stepped in.
Yeah.
The strict Navy admiral who told him he had no talent, the man whose world Jim spent his entire life running away from.
Yeah.
He consulted a classics professor and placed a flat stone with a bronze plaque on the grave.
Yeah, the inscription is written in Greek. It says Tatan dana ataisa, katatan daimona e utoi.
Which translates roughly to true to his own spirit, or according to his own demon.
A really profound choice by his father.
It is. So what does this all mean for us? Wrapping up this deep dive, we have to remember that when you look past the caricatures in pop culture, like the Oliver Stone movie, which his bandmates famously hated because it ignored his sensitive sides, Jim Morrison wasn't just a drunken cartoon.
No, he wasn't.
He was a brilliant, deeply flawed poet who weaponized his own intellect and trauma to change music forever.
And for you listening today, his story is an incredibly potent warning. In our modern era, where everyone has a carefully curated online persona, Morrison represents the ultimate cautionary tale.
Yeah, that's so true.
What happens when the avatar you create to protect yourself becomes a monster you can no longer control? He built the Lizard King to escape the confines of his military upbringing, but the audience demanded the monster so fiercely that the persona eventually swallowed him whole.
It is a heavy thought. And it leaves me with a final question for you to ponder. That Greek epitaph his father chose means true to his own spirit. But given the Jekyll and Hyde nature of his life, the genius reading demonology versus the man inciting riots, the real question is, which spirit was he finally true to in the end? The sensitive poet or the chaotic lizard king? I guess we'll never know.